Thank you so much, Paolo and Richard, for joining us today. Let's start by talking about the last comments by Lavrov, talking about all of the non-Syrian militias to leave Syria. What do you think he means by saying non-Syrian militias? Does he?
I mean, the Russian position has always been that they were invited in their air campaign by the Syrian government, so they're legitimate. They don't advertise it, but they have the same position towards the Iranians and Hezbollah. Anybody else, Turkey, Americans, anyone else in there is not there legally and should leave. That's constant. But they've never. I mean, what's interesting is they've tried to do that at the level of law, but in actual practice, they've been more cautious about attacking any foreign militia under the protection of Turkey or the U.S. But anyone not covered, such as volunteers who joined the insurgency, even Syrian citizens, are fair game for the government.
Exactly. But when he's talking about the southern part of Syria, when he says this, because that was part of where right now the United States and Israel are being very clear about the Iranian militia's presence. But what do you think, to add to Richard's points, what do you think he means when Lavrov says all foreign militias?
Well, that's not, again, it's subject to interpretation. Is Iran presence in Syria a militia? Does that fall under that category? That would be really odd because in a practical sense, Iran and Russia are working on the same side to support President Assad. So how should one interpret all this, that everybody's got to leave? Then we, the Russians, are the only legitimate foreign power because, as he pointed out, we're here under the invitation of the Syrian government, and so we were compliant with international law, right of self-defense, UN Charter, all that. It's not entirely clear. I guess we'll find out very soon. But I would be skeptical to assume that the Russians mean that the Iranians have to leave.
Mm-hmm. There's clearly some evidence of differences between Iran and Russia. I mean, I think the Russians, a lot of them, I don't, the government's not clear, but a lot of influential in the Russian national security establishment would like to withdraw a lot, if not most, of their forces in Syria, because they really need the forces elsewhere. And if they can just, get their regime in power, they're happy. The Iranians, I'm not sure how eager they are to leave. I mean, they seem to want to stay there for a while, gives them possible options with Lebanon, with Jordan, with Israel. And that includes even because a lot of the Iranian forces are people who maybe they don't want back in Iran, Afghan refugees or others who they just send off as their militia. And so it might be useful. There's clearly, that's one difference. There might be other differences too.
But there's also obviously the fact that I guess the Russians, as everybody else can see, that Iranian forces in Syria are attacking or plan to attack Israel now. And when the Israelis countered that, they went to Moscow. Netanyahu went to Moscow and said, hey guys, this is what we plan to do. In other words, this is not, again, this is my interpretation, this is not an anti-Russian move. Just let it be understood that we will never tolerate a direct threat against the national security of Israel. This is our survival. And so please be advised that this is what we intend to do. Again, that's my own fill in the blanks here. And so I think that the Russians don't particularly welcome another twist in the conflict that turns into a joint action between the Iranian militias, Hezbollah and what have you, ganging up against Israel, knowing full well that Israel will never tolerate this.
Yeah, and these gaps may widen. I know that initially the main Russian complaint about the Iranians was they weren't fighting as effectively as they wanted to do in Syria. So after the Russian Air Force intervened in November, they and the Syrian government were able to seize some territory, and they had the Iranians in it, and they weren't as effective at protecting that. Often the Russians had to reoccupy that. Hezbollah has been more effective as the ground forces. Now since they're becoming more comfortable in the ground situation, I think the momentum is on the face of the Syrian government, they have less need for the Iranian and Hezbollah ground forces. So they may be comfortable at some point having them withdraw. But again, it's not clear to me that the Iranians want to do that.
Well, we know that Israel is the wild card in this, and Israel has been clear even a few hours ago, less than 48 hours ago, they did say again that they don't want any Iranian militias presence in any part of Syria. So they are clear about this direction that they're heading. Right now, we know that also Lieberman is going to Moscow to meet with the Russian defense minister. What is the Israeli message today to Russia?
Well, as I said a moment ago, I think that they want to make clear to Russia that if you guys, Russians, want to stay in Syria under the terms of your bilateral agreement with Damascus and keep your air base, keep your naval base, etc., grudgingly we'll accept that. But Iran is a different story, because Iran is a sworn enemy. They can live with Russia, maybe not be friends, the Israelis I mean, but they can live with that, but not with the Iranians, because they understand that this is an existential threat to them, and that the Iranians cannot be negotiated with on the same level that they can talk to Moscow. And so I think that putting their cards on the table, and indeed, a high-ranking cabinet member going to Moscow, signals the same intent. That is, we are not happy with what's happening in Syria, but one thing, let's be clear between us, no Iranians. Because that's a threat to us.
And we heard that Russia was also kind of leaning towards agreeing with Israel before, with few comments that we've heard a few weeks ago. But where did that bring the Russian-Iranian relationship? I mean, you did mention that they have some disagreements, we're talking about very major
so far,
disagreements.
The Trump administration, the Israelis, the Saudis and others have pressed the Russians to distance themselves from the Iranians with limited effect. I mean, now with the Trump administration sort of launching a full-court offensive against Iran, the Russians were probably even less inclined to do so, because the Iranians, they have more influence over Iran now. They have more leverage because the Iranians need them more. And the Russians still think they benefit from having Iran as their partner. Iranians don't bother them. No terrorism.
While Israel is destroying every Iranian military base.
Yeah, but it's also somewhat useful to the Russians, because it keeps the Iranians from it's still dependent on Russia's goodwill a bit more. It's a complex game. The Russians and Iranians aren't normally partners. They've been recently, and you could in the future imagine them splitting. But for now, they each see advantages in having and staying close to each other.
I see that you're shaking your head.
Well, I'm saying I agree. I think, but this is not a natural alliance. This is not Great Britain and the United States. This is not a special relationship. This is an alliance of convenience that, again, since both sides are kind of aligned against the West, against the United States, and certainly in the Syrian conflict, supporting the same side, then it makes sense for them to cooperate. But I don't see this love and this sense, oh boy, we are here together to build this axis, Moscow, Tehran, and then we will redraw the map of the Middle East. It's an alliance of convenience, but which has its limits. I don't think that it is in Russia's interest to see a conflagration potentially ignited by Iranian foolish activities that would really trigger a massive Israeli response, which I think we can be assured that's exactly what's going to happen. If Israel feels that it's really threatened, it will not play. It will be a serious response.
Yes.
And I don't think it's in Russia's interest to see this happening. I don't see they have anything to gain.
So what are the options then? What are Russia's options in Syria?
Well, as he just said, let this play out to the extent that the Israelis hit the Iranians. It cleans the mess for them. They don't have to do it themselves.
Yeah.
And it enhances Russia's influence. In other words, if Iranians' influence in Syria is diminished, well, that's all to Russia's advantage, right?
So they
Because
have full
there's no
control. They have full
there's
control
no
of what
condominium.
happens in the end of the ending game.
Yeah, I mean, their ambition, and they still think they can get this, is basically to restore Syrian government control over
The entirety.
Yeah, and then they'll have their air bases, they'll have a good client, and then they can exploit, perhaps build on that, which is going to be more difficult, to gain influence in other areas. They look at Iraq and so on. Iran, it's a partner as in some areas economically. It's in the security domain in some, but it's not as reliable as they want, and I still think so. They're looking to diversify their portfolio.
Okay. But now we're also hearing that Russia is trying to take advantage of the de-escalation zone in southern Syria to talk about, okay, so we will withdraw all of the foreign militias from southern Syria, including the United States military base in Tenf. What do you expect the American response would be under this administration? Will they actually pack up and leave Tenf?
It's been very confusing. Our
Yes.
president has said different things at different times. I mean, there's President Trump's natural instinct is to limit the American engagement in these kind of conflicts. He's got other priorities, Iran, counterterrorism, North Korea, and so he would prefer, as you've seen with the administration efforts, to try and get an air force, for example, to replace the U.S. leaving. But the Defense Department, State Department, people in Congress, most of the national security community wants to keep some U.S. military presence for a while, at least to give the U.S. some leverage over developments in the country, and particularly the peace process. If the U.S. withdraws, then there's really the only influence we'd have is really at the level of a high-level diplomacy. We could block a supporting UN resolution, for example, to endorse whatever peace agreement the Iranians and Russians and Turks and Syrians come up with. But if we keep the forces there, they have to deal with it. The U.S. has much more leverage.
Yeah.
But again, President Trump's instinct is the U.S. has overextended itself in the Middle East, and so he's looking for areas to cut.
Yeah. What do you think?
I agree. It is contradictory. Let us not forget that just a few days, really, before the chemical attack, that triggered Trump's response, Trump had said, we're out. Basically, he said it in very clear terms. It's time to go. Let somebody else take this over. This is not our fight. Let's go home. And again, prior to that, months before, Secretary Mattis had said, no. We are here. We have to, the areas that we kind of control jointly with the Kurds in northeastern Syria, we should stay there, keep our positions in order, as Richard just said, to have leverage. But leverage on what? I mean, to be honest, I don't really think America has much leverage on anything. And in order to have leverage, then you would have to convey to both Moscow and Damascus that you are willing to redouble. That is to say, we want a particular political outcome out of this crisis, and we are prepared to invest in all this. Every signal that we've got, and this goes back to the Obama administration, that we don't. That we're willing to do a few things, like supporting the Kurds when there was still an ongoing raging fight against ISIL, which now is kind of almost nothing, and that's about it. Supporting the democratic, Syrian opposition was a disaster, a complete disaster, and in fact,
I mean, because of, we have to be clear why, because of the previous administration was not serious enough,
exactly.
and then this administration.
Well, again, but the previous administration, if we all recall, not to go back too long, but when Ash Carter was asked, at some point, well, how many, free Syrian fighters have you trained? And he said 5 or something to that effect.
Something embarrassing.
5, 10.
Yeah,
that was.
I think it was a CENTCOM commander in Congress, but yeah, basically that was.
Yeah.
That was embarrassing. That's
it was.
And that's kind of takes the benchmark of American commitment. So right now in terms of tactical moves, is America going to withdraw from a particular base or another? I'm not quite sure. It is contradictory. It seems to me the White House pushes for liquidation. People at defense, and state would say, no, let's not be too hasty. Let's keep our assets for a while because they may be useful later on. But then you better have a plan. And I don't see a plan. Unfortunately, there has never been a plan. And it was most unfortunate when it goes back to President Obama, when the troubles in Syria started and he said, Assad has got to go. That seemed to be pretty strong, right? But then you are the president of the United States, you got to make him go.
Yeah.
Make him go.
Exactly.
And he did absolutely nothing that was,
Going back to those comments, those contradictory comments by the administration, and let's stick to the Trump administration, he did mention during the Macron's visit, President Macron, that they are talked about the corridor of Iran, the Iranian corridor from Iraq through Syria to the Mediterranean. And he did mention, and they did actually talk about it in other terms afterwards, that they were talking about the 10th and the American presence in northern and eastern part of Syria, that this is the leverage the United States has when it decides to do so, is to close off this area. So would the United States be willing to let go of that card if they are serious? And now we hear and we know about the sanctions on daily basis that we know against Iranian militias, Iranian entities, and we'll talk about that more in details in a little bit.
Well, anyway, well, the answer is definitely if that's a policy objective to foreclose that option, to prevent the Iranians of gaining, a kind of a seamless access from Iran via Syria into Lebanon and what have you, and have access to the sea and use this for nefarious purposes, then of course that changes things a bit. And it makes sense for the United States to stay there to foreclose that option. So that makes sense, and especially as we are ratcheting up pressures against Iran for other reasons, which is the nuclear, well, not exactly, combined reasons.
Yes.
It's the nuclear deal and of course our manifested stronger position to the machinations in the region. So that's one part of it. And so that would make sense. So that's really not about Syria itself, that's about Iran again. So I would say that in that context, it would make sense for the United States to stay there and prevent any Iranian move aimed at creating this corridor that they would control and that would benefit them. And it would also be potentially a sanctions busting opportunity for Tehran.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear the administrations have thought a lot about the nuclear deal, but some of their anti-Iran strategy seems undeveloped. Syria, I would say, a little unclear if they fully thought about how they're going to drive the Iranians out of Syria. Iraq with the elections, I think they're still trying to figure out what to do. Afghanistan, it's still, it's some of the 12 points that the Secretary of State laid out. Not all of them are really, I think, have worked down to the operational level. Because you could imagine if that's your highest priority, counter Iran, then logically you'd want to get rid of Assad or or at least minimize the Iranian role in Syria. But they don't. It seems disconnected somewhat.
Yes. So you're not seeing an American leadership in Syria. We see more of an Israeli leadership against Iran in Syria, at least.
Well, for Israel, it's self-preservation. That's a very clear. That's a very clear policy that I think.
So that could be what's happening is that Saudi Arabia is taking care of the Yemen situation. Israel is basically countering Iran in Syria. And the United States is basically doing its own calculations. Let's talk about the economy, the Iranian economy, because we are hearing also now, on daily basis almost, new sanctions against members, institutions within the Iran. Now Avin's prison in Tehran, which is very famous, notorious, bad prison that, where people get tortured, and now we know from the protesters who were held there. What does that mean, though, for the Iranian regime, these sanctions that we're seeing? And we heard about Ashab al-Haq, all these militias in Iraq who were flourishing and having their own political parties in Iraq. Now they're getting sanctions.
Look, it's bad news, definitely. Now, the question is whether America has now, acting pretty much on its own without the at least open support of the European allies, and certainly the, if not open, at least oblique opposition of China and Russia, whether America has still got the clout to make Iran suffer further. I think it does. more so than we think, because any and all dollar-denominated transactions have to be cleared somewhere, somehow, through American financial institutions. And so America has quite a bit of clout. And also the bad news, which was not properly understood, I think, again, but this is what seems to have transpired, that even with the benefits of the sanction lifting after the agreement, the Iranian economy is not doing well. In other words, it's not that they had this flourishing and this great boom because, oh my God, sanctions are over, it's a party, everybody's coming in, all these great investments. Not much has happened. I mean, there have been some benefits, but as the riots last year indicated, not enough. People are suffering, and those were not political, how can I say, actions. These were kind of acts of desperation of people who don't have food, who the prices of everything is going up. So I think that the Iranian economy is probably a lot worse than we think, and that therefore the bite of the new sanctions will be probably more significant than others would expect. I mean, I was on a panel with an Iranian, as it were, and he was saying, his point was, oh, America can't do this, it's illegal. He didn't say it's not going to do anything to us. He says, oh, this is against the law, international law, UN resolutions, but trying to not saying we don't care because we'll sail through this, it doesn't matter to us. So I thought that as a sign of weakness, and although not openly declared. And it seems to me that this is serious business. I'm not sure that it will be enough to threaten the stability of the regime. It may take more than that, but I think they will bite.
Yeah, I mean, Iran benefited from the nuclear deal somewhat from the investment, somewhat from relaxed sanctions, and more recently from the rise in global hydrocarbon prices, oil and so on. So now the sanctions come back on. The Iranians, there was not much U.S. investment involvement, but the thinking still is that your typical president of a European, probably a Chinese company,
twice.
Yeah, if you invest in Iran, then you lose access to the U.S. dollar, the U.S. financial system, and so you probably won't do that. And the Iranians are in a tough situation there because they can then say, okay, we're not getting out of this deal, let's withdraw. Then they risk further alienating the Europeans who are right now on the fence. And so this should put a lot of pressure on them. Then what follows, we don't know. I mean, people can speculate that the regime is so powerful it can force the people to go back to suffer, and that's okay. Or others say, well, eventually they'll yield. Look at the example of North Korea. The sanctions are what's bringing them to the table. We have the earlier example of Iran. It's just a matter of time. So there'll be a lot of pressure on them. I think that in the whole, the sanctions should be pretty effective.
Let's move to Europe a little bit because, Paolo, you're very good on all of the details of what's happening. We saw after Macron's visit, there's that good relationship and chemistry between President Macron and President Trump. We didn't have the same thing with Merkel, but, we know that the European Union in general has a unified position against pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, even though France seems to be a bit more practical, kind of laying out, we agree with this, we disagree with this is what we need Iran to do. But what is going to be the future of the relationship between the European Union members and Iran, giving now the dead end, basically, from the United States?
The ideal scenario for the Europeans would have been, Iran deal 2.0, that is upgraded. In other words, that if they could have managed to square the circle, it would have been, okay, we keep this deal, and then we add other pieces in which, with a lot of wishful thinking, the Iranians would agree on withdrawing from this and not doing that. That would please the Trump administration, and so they would have, their cake and eat it too. That is, keep the deal, add other constraints on Iranian behavior, and everybody's happy. Trump is happy, they're happy, and Iran grudgingly accepts. That was obviously not workable because the Iranians didn't oblige. And so now, as my Richard just said, the Europeans are in a pickle because clearly they would like to be in Iran and invest and gain something. Airbus wants to sell airplanes. Total wanted to invest, in oil facilities and what have you, automotive investments. So for them, this was a lucrative new market. On the other hand, do you want to do business with Iran or with the United States? An economy where you have about, 20 billion, 25 billion, that's the total exchange, or America where you have almost $1 trillion. It doesn't take a genius to figure out which one is more convenient. Not necessarily what you like best, but the one that is most obviously of significance. So I'm not sure how effective, to be honest with you, European diplomacy can be to square this circle. Of course, they would desperately like to keep the deal on, but with America's position as is, they grudge, they say, oh, look at these Americans, look, always creating complications and what have you. But what can Europe offer on its own, independently of the United States? I would say almost nothing. If they want to have a policy, it has to be coordinated somehow with the United States, whether they like it or not. And the position of the United States after Pompeo's speech, at the Heritage Foundation, it's quite clear. I mean, they may change, they tweak it, they modify, whatever, but it's quite clear. This is all out, political and diplomatic and economic warfare against Iran. And to the bitter end, it seems here. Not like, oh, we put 12 things here, but guess what? Wink, wink, we'll settle for 6. I don't think so, at least not now.
What's really interesting, though, is that the European Union was not okay when the Obama administration was trying to negotiate this deal to begin with because of the human rights violation by the Iranian regime against the people in the region, supporting terrorism. I mean, talking about supporting harboring al-Qaeda leaders today in Tehran. The human rights violations of the Iranian people. It's kind of like, why do you want to give that leverage and that economical wealth to this evil regime? So it's kind of interesting.
The French made their objections clear on that.
Yes, and they were very clear. French specifically were very clear. I mean, now we see that the European Union were not concerned about that anymore. They're basically very focused on their business.
Yes, absolutely. And again, if we want to keep this in context, for years, as the Americans were kind of looking on, the Europeans went back and forth negotiating with Tehran, accomplishing absolutely zero, nothing. And all grandstanding and talking this and that and what have you. And yes, there is principled opposition against obviously the human rights violations, etc. But indeed, once the deal was struck, people started seeing dollar or euro signs, whatever you want to say. Oh, now it's great. We're open for business. Yummy, yummy. Let's go sign contracts and big sales. And that's the thing that kept this thing going more than anything else.
Exactly.
And so when America comes in and spoils this game, they're very unhappy. But once again, what is it that they can offer on their own without the active endorsement and participation of Washington? I think very little.
Very little. So the end of this deal is what we're going to be seeing coming next. Probably this is what we have.
Again, I don't know if there's going to be a formal declaration that somebody says, okay, the deal is over, or maybe, a quiet burial without announcements, that nobody says anything, but we understand that it's no longer enforceable.
That is basically dead. Let's move to the agreement by the United States and Turkey on Manbij, where now they have a deal to have a partnership in terms of the forces between Turkish and American forces in that city. What are the odds for this to succeed and to be and stay in place?
Well, I think, again, it has to come. I'm sorry.
No, I think you probably know this one better.
Well,
my speculation is just that the Kurdish issue is less salient at the moment, so this will last as long as it lasts.
Look, the way I see it, at the very beginning, you remember when there was that unfortunate announcement of the border force, the 30,000, which was really ill-considered, and then everybody in Ankara went berserk and said, we're going to have Kurdish army at our border, allied with the PKK, and they thought, oh my God, this is a disaster. And so they announced this huge offensive, which then culminated in the attack against Afrin and all that. But then when Tillerson was still in charge, and he went to Ankara to diffuse the tensions, and they said, the Americans, what is it more important to us? The Kurds in Syria or Ankara? That's basically what it is.
Yeah.
And now they seem to have, maybe, under superior orders by the White House, we want to salvage our relationship with Turkey. And therefore, we don't want to do anything that irritates them or makes them believe that we are, the Turks are famous for conspiratorial theories. And the idea that the Americans are arming the Kurds in Syria in order to stage some kind of an insurrection in Turkey fits very well with all sorts of anti-American conspiracies, which are all over the place and fanned by many elements of the Turkish media. So it seems to me that's a long introduction to say that's probably going to stick.
That's going to stick.
It's going to stick. In other words, there's whatever the tactical and logistical complexities on the ground may be, I think that there's no political interest in Washington to maintain an irritant, which is more than an irritant. It's the Turks, rightly or wrongly, view this as an existential threat. So the fact that America, would support Kurdish forces in Syria, which are openly allied to the PKK, cannot stand.
Yeah.
And so I really think that they'll find some kind of a deal.
Yeah, but I mean, do you mean and do you think, Richard, that we're going to see a withdrawal from the American support to the Kurds in other parts of the northern part of Syria?
That's the historical pattern, isn't it? The U.S. sort of abandons the Kurds in the end.
Always.
Yeah. So, I think.
But I mean, they still have the Kurdistan.
Yeah.
Iraq.
I mean, I thought we thought
they're still there.
Yeah, we thought the Trump administration would do that. Remember that the first national security advisor was very close to the Turkish government view about the Gulen movement and other areas, and it looked like we were going to see a complete reversal, but that hasn't occurred. The relationship with Turkey just goes up and down, and the Turks are playing around with Iran and Russia on the peace agreement, and their views of what to do in Syria are still as confused as ours, it sounds like it sometimes. And then there's, of course, the domestic situation in Turkey with Erdogan and the ballot and, for his presidential authority. So it's a very confused picture. I think that the Trump administration, the current team, probably is very sympathetic to the Kurds, would like to work with the Kurds. But when push comes to shove, I don't know. I mean, I think the Kurdistan referendum was a bit of a surprise. Yeah, but it was, and so that sort of deflated a lot of aspirations for what the Kurds' role might be in that region.
Definitely, I echo that. I mean, there is.
But now you're trying to merge what's happening in Syria with Iraq. We're talking about the referendum. This is Barzani, who is actually not an ally of the PKK, who's on the other end.
But people in the region read the U.S. letting the Iraqi government deal as an example of how we're going to do anywhere else with the Kurds, even though
which Kirkuk is not considered to be a Kurdish city.
Well, that was the huge mistake of Barzani. I mean, the very fact that they decided to hold this referendum was really cuckoo. To tell you the truth,
But let's focus on Syria, though.
Yes.
So in Raqqa, in the other parts where of course Hasaka. And so on and so forth. What is the future of these areas?
Well, it all depends on how the Kurds want to behave. Again, I don't think.
What does Ankara want? I mean, because those Kurds are not going anywhere. But
Ankara wants the YPG to be completely disarmed and labeled as a terrorist organization affiliated with the PKK.
If the Kurds separate themselves from the YPG and the PKK, would
that's a
that be
different story.
better?
The Turks have been saying all along that, of course, the Kurds are fine. We have no problem with the Kurds themselves. We have the problem with the terrorists because they are allied with our own, homegrown domestic terrorists. And in fact, we've been hosting Many Kurds, refugees, who fled again from all the violence and this and that. So to the extent that the Kurds are separated politically, militarily, what have you, from the PKK, and America stops arming them, we don't have problems with the Kurds. I mean, we're fine with the Kurds. That's that's Ankara's position, and in fact, we will help them. We will, do whatever we can to help resettlement and rebuilding and
until this happens, while now we have this agreement in Manbij, is Ankara better with the United States? Is more willing to cooperate with the United States now having this deal in Manbij, and they already took Afrin? I mean, what more can the United States do at this point for Turkey?
Give back Fethullah Gulen, but that's
so Gulen is okay. So now the main.
I'm just saying,
that would help a lot, but it's not going to happen.
Yes.
I mean, the Turks have the same complication we do. They don't have a really strong partner there because they don't want to deal with the Kurds, and they don't like the Assad government. So they're like us. We're all very unhappy with what's happening in Syria, but we haven't really been able to think of a more positive solution.
Yeah.
I suppose in the end the Turks will just deal with Assad, and what I think they would like is to have I hate to bring up Iraq again, but they were comfortable, it seems, with how their relationship with the Kurds in Iraq in the last few years.
Yeah.
It seemed, and they probably wanted something like that. Kurds that were deferential to their security needs, that they had good economic benefits, that didn't have any aspirations for autonomy.
I believe, the Turkey had a diplomatic representation in Erbil. I mean, they had, in other words, their relation before this whole business of the referendum, changed entirely the atmosphere. They were comfortable, and by the way, as we know, the Kurds in Iraq depend heavily on Turkey to move their oil. Now, of course, they got a lot less oil because they lost Kirkuk and all that. But in other words, what that example proves is that Turkey is perfectly capable of dealing in a reasonably peaceful manner with Kurds, as long as they're not affiliated with the PKK and deny sanctuary to them. I don't think they have a real problem with the Kurds as such. What they're afraid of is armed and militant Kurds that they believe are associated with the PKK.
Okay. I don't know if you heard the point from Richard when he said that Turkey in the end will actually deal with Assad.
Yes, I think so. I mean, of course, at the beginning, it was completely different. But now, of course, being also somehow the third party in this triangle, Russia, Tehran, Turkey, right? The Sochi, whatever group.
Yes.
They recognize the facts on the ground. Assad is not going to go away. And Turkey is not going to fight a war against Damascus all by itself. It's completely out of the question. So they, I guess, not happily, but they will accept the reality, and that's the way it's going to be. And again, I don't know what their behind-the-scenes dealings with Russia are, but again, Turkey's concerns are different from the others.
Yeah.
We have geostrategic concerns, balance of power, whatever. For Turkey, it's their border.
Yeah.
It's a long border with Syria. And so their concerns are really, really mundane, as in, how do we make sure this border is secure?
What about Idlib? This is an area where Russia has its own, threats that keeps talking about we're gonna, attack this region, which has everybody who left their homes, who were kicked out of their homes in other parts of Syria. They went to Idlib because there is the former Jabhat al-Nusra there, the Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham that's still in Idlib. What do you think Turkey's position would be, and how would they deal with Russia if this actually took place and Russia attacked that region in Syria?
The Russia-Turkey relationship is as complicated as the Russian-Iranian relationship. So it varies. I mean, a couple of years ago it was terrible. Remember, they shot down the Russian plane. Last few years it's been on the upturn. The Russians, though, have some ties with the Kurds. They clearly support Assad more closely than they support Turkey. So I don't know. I don't think the Russians would. I think we will get to, right now, as you know, they've been moving everybody to Idlib. I think they're still working with the Syrian government. They just got the Damascus
suburbs.
Yeah, recovered. I think now they're working in some other areas. I think that's where they're going to go last. They may work out something with arrangement with the Turks. It's probably more likely. I think at least for a while.
What do you think?
I agree. Again, these are sticky points, but these are tactical issues. These are not strategic issues. The war is lost. In other words, the anti-Assad opposition is finished. There's bits and pieces, pockets here and there, but strategically they have no chance. So, and I don't think, again, if the United States, I go back to what we were discussing earlier, if the United States had really wanted to make a serious commitment, and would have said, no, we're going to win this thing, and we're going to get Assad out, or we're going to put so much, we're going to make him bleed so much that he has to negotiate with us on terms that we, put on the table. I don't see any of that happening. And again, I don't see Turkey being able to do this on its own. And even though it may have some stake in some aspects of the tactical situation in Syria, I agree with Richard, bit by bit, the Assad regime, with Russian help, is regaining control over the entirety
and
of the
Idlib,
territory.
it's a very complicated place because it's the loss of life would be massive if any attack does happen on this region because it's cluttered with people.
There will be a negotiated surrender of some kind, I think. Some kind of face-saving thing whereby people will be allowed to leave or something, something like that.
Quickly, let's go to Yemen. We know that now the Houthis are, being getting weaker and weaker, even now in their places where they are, their headquarters. Now they're losing and they're negotiating surrender in these major cities like Sada. So what do you expect that's going to, the outcome is going to be for the Houthis in Yemen? And if they do get defeated, because we hear that Iran is negotiating also about letting go of them, what does that mean for Saudi Arabia and for the region?
It'd be great for the Saudis if the war ended. It's just some massive money. Their Saudi budget is like the highest in the world in terms of per capita. I think it's like $7,000 per capita every year. It's about a third of the national budget. It's just an enormous burden on the Saudi economy. They could use that. As you know, the Crown Prince has a great vision for where they want to put the country in 2030, and it's going to be not attainable if they're still have to
in that war.
Yeah, and so it'd be really great if the war were to end. Missile strikes would stop. They'd have a government in Yemen that would concentrate on economic development and humanitarian issues.
I fully agree. In other words, this will be a huge victory because this is a major, open commitment on the part of the Saudis to intervene. And if the conflict ends and their side wins, of course, this is a huge propaganda and public relations and political victory, not to mention, indeed, the end of this hemorrhaging of funds, which has been far, far greater than anybody had anticipated at the beginning. And of course, a black eye for the Iranians that see one area of where they could have potentially expanded, their influence in and being foreclosed to them. So that would be good if indeed, as you anticipated. These news are that that the war is going badly for the pro-Iranian side. Well, then that would be one item of good news here.
Yeah.
That would be good, even though, let's be frank, the country is destroyed and it's really one of the worst humanitarian crises, which we don't hear much about because the news coverage is modest and so we don't really know, but the horrors are really, really...
really bad because of the Houthis and what they're doing to the country. Okay, let's actually, if we can talk a little bit also about Iraq quickly. We know that now, there's that new coalition between Sadr and the other parties who are a little bit not as pro-Iran or completely aligned with Iran as al-Maliki and al-Amiri are. What is the future of this alliance, and do you think we're going to see Iran completely sitting quiet, watching this as it unveils?
No, the Iranians are already very active. I mean, but we know how difficult it is to form a government in Iraq. It takes months. We've seen this before. There are now, it appears the parliament's approved a rerunning of some of the ballot, or at least recounting the ballot in Kurdistan because of some election irregularities. So that's throwing everything into doubt. How that's going to work, I mean, Sadr seems to be a bit of an opportunist, but it's good that the Saudis have been working with him because they were pretty much on the sidelines in Iraq for a while, and to get them back in the game would be good. But it depends a lot on the U.S. role. Is the U.S. going to fight to preserve its interests in Iraq? Will it keep troops there? Will it insist that the limits on the Iranian, the pro-Shiite and the Shiite militia? Or is it going to take a hands-off approach? And I mean, because logically, if they go back to the 12-point speech, if your priority is countering Iran, rolling back Iranian influence, Iraq would be a logical place to do that. But so far, we haven't seen that yet. The U.S. role has been kind of quiet on that election.
Well, I would say that, again, if we, unless we completely lost our minds, we made such an incredible investment in Iraq over so many years, that even though the outcome is hardly what I suppose President Bush thought that would be, with the demise of Saddam Hussein, it didn't exactly play out the way they thought, with democracy and and a secular government taking over and being pro-American, engaging in spreading the democratic gospel in the region. That didn't quite happen, as we know. That said, even though the situation is hardly ideal, to just to fold our tents and leave the ground open to the pro-Iranian forces, political allies of Tehran, I think would be rather foolish. And so I would think that there would be some kind of an effort to maintain the American leverage and political influence and the military advisors. Again, the whole story of ISIL and Mosul and all that, it's over, mercifully. And it ended up not so badly, in the end. But this can happen again. I mean, in other words, Iraq has not become all of a sudden Switzerland, with this harmonious, government, well-oiled machinery. So I would think that America would try to maintain its somehow its leverage and its influence, which is not inconsiderable.
I have to end it here. I want to thank you both for joining me today, Richard and Paolo. Hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.